Good afternoon, everybody. It is Thursday, August 26th. We are Liberal Arts MBA. I feel so official, like a newscaster, when I do that. My name is Sarah Sands. I'm your co-host. I'm coming to you live from the great city of Houston, Texas, where I am cultivating my belonging this week and sending joy and gratitude out the universe. I got a part-time job. I got my data approved for my dissertation. I am living some other bitch's life and I'm claiming squatters' rights. I'm going to stay in it. I am loving it.
Grab some scratch offs.
I'm going to go buy a lotto ticket. Last night I went to the grocery store and bought bread, but I think I need to go get some actual bread, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Thank you to our fabulous community for joining us this week. We are so excited. I'm going to kick it over to my co-host, Jacob, to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Jacob Sager. Good to see you, everybody, today on Thursday afternoon. I'm in Austin, Texas. I'm in front of my angular bookshelves, and I think I'm coming under the weather, but I will get some chicken soup in me as soon as possible.
For the soul, for all the souls. And this week, we are joined by the genius and brilliance that is Errol Saunders II. Errol, how are you doing this week?
I'm great. I'm living my best life. I'm joining you from New Haven, Connecticut, both beautiful and historic. I'm really excited to have students in my life again after a long, long summer. So, I'm living the dream.
Errol, school has not started yet, has it?
No, school has not started yet. So the school I teach at doesn't start until after Labor Day, as per tradition. And this year, Rosh Hashanah is right before Labor Day, right after Labor Day. So we're not starting until the Wednesday after Labor Day. It's like a whole extra week of summer vacation.
Yeah,
that's great that the school is incorporating the fact that Rosh Hashanah is right there, and since that's a minority cultural observance, that it's being observed by the community, or respectfully, like, not putting the stress on that minority community that they're going to miss the first day of school. I know lots of people who moved into dorms and wanted to celebrate the holiday, but were not, because they felt, school is starting and I don't want to miss out on this. This is everyone else is there, and that's the community I'm part of. So that's really awesome to hear.
Yeah. It was a shock to me when I went from, K through 12 in Louisiana and also college in Louisiana, and then moved eventually to New York City, where Jewish people were everywhere, and so much so that, and all sorts of people were everywhere, that, New York City observes Eid and Chinese Lunar New Year and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
That's
and
awesome.
The fact that I didn't, people knew what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur was, and it was expected that I would not be there for them, and the schools closed for them, was mind-blowing to me for the first time in my life, to have that experience at the age of 24. We're about to get into Errol's story, but first I want to thank everyone for joining us this week. You know where to find us. We are on LinkedIn and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, all under Liberal Arts MBA. Please follow, subscribe, particularly on LinkedIn, so we can start streaming through there.
And if you enjoy any of these episodes, please share the stories, share them through your own social media and maybe send a message directly to anyone that you think might relate to one of these stories. These conversations are, we're having them. It's the three of us here, but we're having them to share and really put out there and really resonate as far as we can. So share, subscribe, as Sarah says, wherever it is, whatever works for you, even email if that's the best way to do it. You can't print us out, but we'll get to that one day.
Errol, do you have any tips as a teacher in the digital age of how to reach people online?
Ooh. I tend to send them to YouTube clips.
Nice.
YouTube is a great way for me to kind of curate what I want students to see, and also to kind of think about when they go down that rabbit hole of clicking on the next thing and clicking on the next thing, what they're going to look like, what the rabbit hole will look like, and how they will read or skim around the topic. So That's my thing, putting YouTube links everywhere.
Love it. Errol's already sharing his brilliance with us, so let's get into his story. So Errol Saunders, I'm so excited to have him here today, that he agreed to do this as part of episode 10. Errol and I met, 5 years ago. I don't know, it feels like it's been decades now. We met 5 years ago at Teachers College in a privatization of education class, where we realized that we were kindred souls and needed to be friends forever, like we're in 4th grade, as one does. Errol has a BA in political science from Yale, an MEd, a master's education in curriculum and teaching from Teachers College, Columbia University, and he is currently an EDD student, getting his doctorate in curriculum and teaching, also at Teachers College. And along the way, he has been a teacher and a doctoral fellow, and is now executive director of the Pathfinder program at Hopkins School. He's also a board member on the board of directors at Common Ground High School Urban Farm and Environmental Education Center in New Haven, Connecticut, and is also on, he will talk more about this and can share more about the nuances of his story in terms of all the wonderful organizations and nonprofits and governing bodies that he has contributed to. And he will also be lecturing at Yale this fall. What will you be teaching at Yale?
So I'm teaching a class that's called Race, Place, and Memory in Schools, where we really look at particular school reform movements in particular locations and think about how racialized understandings of the past are contributing to the dynamics of that reform movement.
There's so much to break down there, but I know that one of the things you're studying is emplaced belonging. Does this have to do with emplaced belonging, and what does that mean?
All right. So this does have some things to do with emplaced belonging. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how do people come to feel like they belong in a location or a geography, and that belonging has to do with all kinds of things that are happening in that geography. Everything from the building to the music that plays over the loudspeaker, to who happens to be there when you visit, to the kinds of ways, even the languages that people use when they're explaining things. And so the class really starts to talk about how those things are operating in reform movement conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how people are kind of bringing what their understandings of place to the conversations about reforms that are happening in their municipality or their geography.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like to me like it's like thinking about place in ways that aren't just like pointing on Google Maps to a location and being like, I went to Grace King High School, being like, this is Grace King High School, and then navigating to the like place of it where the location is, but thinking of it more in terms of like, how does it exist in our understandings of the community and our understandings of ourselves? Who are the people that are in that school, and what are the experiences that they're bringing, both teachers and students? It sounds like it's more of like cultivating a collective understanding of what place means socially to us and not just geographically.
Exactly. What does place mean socially to us, and how do those social meanings turn into feelings? Right? How do those social meanings turn into the feelings of I belong or I do not, or where I belong and where I do not belong? And ultimately, with my dissertation, the idea is that those feelings of belonging actually have an impact on whether or not you do well in school. Actually, belonging has been pretty clearly connected to how well you do in school, but the idea of belonging as in place hasn't been as much. So that is something that I'm hoping to fill in with my research.
So important.
With all your research and hearing about your credentials and talking the other day, one thing I thought was interesting that you shared was, as an adult in New Haven, you recently learned how to drive, or you recently got a driver's license, and didn't get that until your 30s. But there's a very like rich and interesting reason behind that, and I just wanted you to share that and just kind of start there.
Yeah. So for a long time, I've been an environmentalist for a very long time before it was cute. And
Before we were like making plant walls on Instagram, just getting
Right.
a Errol's plant wall.
And so in high school, I went to went to Northview High School in Covina, California, and we had one of the nation's few high school solar racing teams. So we actually designed, built, and raced solar-powered cars across country in what was then called the Winston Solar Challenge and is now called the Dell Winston Solar Challenge. And so for me, it was like, wait, we're high schoolers and we can build a solar-powered car that's street legal and can go 40 miles per hour. What is the fossil fuel industry doing, right? Like, what is Ford doing? We could absolutely be doing this. And so for a long time, I basically got around by public transit, the heel toe express, which is what we call walking sometimes, and my trusty bicycle, because I have a commuter bike, who now lives in the basement and is a little bit jealous of Putt, my Prius, but that's okay. We still take her out every now and then.
I love that story. What is the fossil fuel industry doing? Do they even know what they're doing other than like paying Congress members loads of money to keep them around? Anyways, should we, now that we've talked about high school, take us back. So you went from your high school in Covina, California to Yale, but that makes it sound like it was a very straightforward trajectory. Take us through the nuance of how you got from Covina to Yale.
So I should actually start a little bit before that. I went to a magnet middle school, right? My family lived in Los Angeles up until my first year of high school. And I went to a magnet middle school.
What does that mean? What does it mean that you went to a magnet middle school?
I went to school. There was a school across the street from me, and I didn't go to it. I was allowed to go to a school that wasn't in my neighborhood, that was like 45 minutes away, through what was called a permit with transportation. And so all of my middle school friends lived all around the city instead of living in my neighborhood. And then my mom decided we were moving to an inner ring suburb for high school. So when I got to Covina, I didn't know anyone, and I was a little bit irritated about not going to the high school I had so carefully chosen out. And so, when I was there, the courses at that school at Northview were fine. I was able to take basically everything I wanted, and everything I wanted included all of the science classes that the high school had to offer, and all of the history classes. I think the only advanced class I didn't take was studio art, but basically APs and all kinds of things. And so when I was applying to college, it had actually always been my dream to go to MIT for astrophysics. I really wanted to be an astrophysicist. I have a lisp, so it's super fun to say astrophysicist. But I really wanted to go. And when I approached my guidance counselor with my early application, my MIT application early, ready to go, she said, "I don't think that's the right place for you. I just went to go visit Yale with my daughter, and I think that would be the right place for you. So basically, I'm not going to fill in your application. I'm not going to send in your application to MIT until you give me this Yale application." I was like, "What are you doing?" Right? No way.
Held hostage by the college counselor.
Exactly, held hostage by the college counselor, and
a cruel jailer.
Huh?
A cruel jailer she was.
I know, right? Oh no, you should apply to an even more elite school, which, by the way, is not the college counseling that almost everyone at school got, to be clear. But I turned in that application, and
rule follower.
Yeah. I turned in that application, and so I applied early to Yale, I applied regular action to Yale, but with an early application, right? My application was in by November 1st, and I applied for early decision at MIT, because back then, early decision was binding. You could only do it to one place. And I got deferred from MIT and got a likely letter from Yale, basically a letter that said, "Hey, you're going to get in, but we can't let you in yet because you didn't apply yet to be let in, but maybe you should consider us. And so that really threw me for a loop. I was really concerned. First of all, this was an option I didn't anticipate having. I applied to all the UCs. I kind of really knew what each of the UCs had to offer for me. I had gone on a kind of like tour of them, like a recruitment tour of them. And I applied to Iowa State because they were like, here's this scholarship that could happen. And I was like, I'm super poor. That would be great. But this Yale, I was not prepared for. And ultimately, that kind of made me think about what my values were. I loved science. I loved math. I still continue to love science and math. But I also am a really social person, and had taken all of the humanities classes at my high school.
Not just taken, but you had TA'd as a high schooler classes in sciences and in humanities.
Yeah, because I had extra periods, right? Like the way that high school was designed was that a kid like me could either have some free periods during a day because I passed all my classes, or do something with them. And with my mom, I was going to do something with them. That was just like not even a question. And so I ultimately ended up deciding to go to Yale over MIT, randomly switching my life dream, because the idea there, and this is something that I still stand behind, is that if I ended up doing, my 17-year-old self basically came to the conclusion that if I ended up doing something that wasn't math or science at MIT, that being a Black man who had a degree from MIT not in math or sciences would have faced a tremendous amount of I don't want to call it discrimination, but people would have thought that I just couldn't make it there. Whereas for Yale, I didn't perceive that there would be the same kinds of issues, regardless of where I majored. And so I ended up going there and, having a great time, just a great time, taking some math classes, taking some science classes, and ultimately really thinking about these issues about cities and suburbs and how they're different and why they're different and why my life was so different when I moved to Covina versus when I lived in Los Angeles.
Let me ask you a question about the education plan or the degree plan at Yale. You said, you took all these different classes and you came in, did this focus in cities and suburbs. How is that structured at Yale, being such an old institution with its, its rich academic process? How do you settle on a major, or how do you pick your academic course there?
So we're actually encouraged not to have a major when you enter, unless you are going to be doing something like in the engineering sciences, right? Yale is firmly committed to liberal arts, or at least my understanding is that Yale is firmly committed to liberal arts. I can't speak for it. And so, we had something called distributional requirements, where you were required to take courses at that time, it was 4 different groups. Group 1 was like languages and humanities. Group 2 was social sciences. Group 4 was math, etc. Right? And so we were encouraged, or actually required, to take a certain number of courses in each of the groups outside of the group that your major was in, right? So, you could take some classes in your major and go, is this for me? And as a first-year advisor, which I am now, I encourage people to take some classes in their major, take some classes major adjacent, and then take some classes that you just heard from a person were cool, or something that you've always wanted to know more about. And so they really, my experience was one where I was really supported in being a well-rounded, kind of holistically educated person with a specialty, right? Which has been really cool. I took a geology class that changed my life and how I think about the world. And I took it because my best friend from the marching band was like, "I'll take a class in your major if you take a class in mine." And so I took a class that was not an intro course, and probably was a mistake academically, but it was definitely not a mistake. Not academically, grade-wise, but was definitely not a mistake academically or interest-wise or experience-wise.
I want to first say that you are like the Black queer male version of Rory Gilmore, debating between she was debating between like Harvard and Yale, but you were debating between MIT and Yale. And I think that's funny. So for all the girls like me out there who grew up with Gilmore girls.
And Gilmore was in my residential college. She was a Brentfordian, just like me.
I also love that you could connect into that. Thank you for justifying my joke.
A Harvard game like that, is actually like that. You can ask my dad. He was like, "What is this? Is this for real?" Yes, it is.
That's ridiculous. The other thing that's really interesting to me is that, I do political science as well. We've talked about this, but you went to Yale and studied political science, not knowing that like the foundational thinkers in political science, Robert Dahl, who wrote Who Governs, which is all about examining the political system of New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale is, he is like one of the foundational thinkers, as well as many others that come out of Yale. And you ended up studying cities and suburbs, which is like one of his specialties. And it sounds like you found your way there because it helped you make sense of your identity and your earlier experiences. And I'm going to pause there. It's a statement that is a question, but I'm curious as to how those studies, how you were drawn into them and how it helped you process your own identity, as you just mentioned, your path from your high school and then into Yale.
So, there are many more now, but there weren't as many first generation low income kids. I guess they're called fly kids now, which I love, at Yale when I went there. And there were just some really interesting things that I kind of pieced together. One was most of my friends that I lived with couldn't identify a situation where there was just a poor person versus a dangerous person. Like they just couldn't figure out the difference between a situation where a neighborhood was poor or a neighborhood was dangerous. Like they couldn't do that. Also, I had friends who had literally never been in a city other than to go to New York City to go to a play. And so their understandings of what city life was really complicated by the idea that we were now, Yale is smack dab in the middle of New Haven. It's in the center. You cannot, it's not a university where you can go through it without a constant daily reminder of how privileged you are, right? I think a lot of people who are Yale undergraduates, that's really disconcerting. For me, I was like, wait, what do you mean I'm privileged now? I don't understand it. I'm still this poor Black kid from Los Angeles, right? And then really trying to think about how do I explain this? Here's this situation I'm in, and how do I explain this world? How do I explain the world where all these people from all over the country are having similar experiences from different metros, and I'm weirdly caught in the middle here? And by studying cities and suburbs, what's really cool is wherever I go, I can read a place, right? That feels really cool. It's something that's very tangible, where you're oh, well, that house is a Queen Anne house, so this neighborhood must have been settled, or at least must have been built in the early 1900s, right? That kind of thing. But also, why are there no stores here, but there are storefronts? And really helping me to understand why it was expected that I needed to go across town to go to school. And then when we moved out to the suburbs, the expectation was that I would go to my neighborhood school, right? And really trying to think about that. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, it did. And I think Jacob's about to plug our little MBA nugget that I think relates to this, but I don't think we always think about the way in which getting these types of educations actually, they're us exploring ourselves and our experiences and helping you. What I heard there was how the education you got and the path you went down was as much predicted by your experiences going into Yale as much as it was helping you to make meaning of those experiences and master your own story in this way.
And I just happened to end up, not randomly, but picking the place that was one of the best places in the world to go for that thing.
Love it.
That's awesome. So I'm going to put up this is our MBA tidbit, our nugget that we're going to get into today. It's a quote from a book called The Liberal Arts of Management, which may or may not have inspired me in coming up with this show conceptually with Sarah. But it's called The Liberal Arts of Management, a toolkit for today's leader by Jim Morosis. And the quote was from this chapter about grammar, actually. And it says, "The manager's challenge, her role as a master of the liberal arts, is to approach every day with a freshness that is open to new perceptions, that is willing and able to recognize change, let it reveal itself for what it is, and work with it in an appropriate manner." And that quote, I feel, goes pretty hand in hand with how you're talking about your perspective growing and the considerations as you were becoming that young adult at that age, and what you were seeing in being in New Haven and that experience with the people around you.
Yeah.
One thing I is, Sarah, did you want to say anything about the quote?
No, I said my piece before you even put the quote.
Okay.
That's how I feel about the quote.
So one thing you touched on briefly here, but is definitely a lot of time and a lot of richness there, was you mentioned that you took a class because your best friend from band was in there. You were in multiple bands at school, right?
Yeah. So I actually started playing. I'm a flute and piccolo player, so I started playing at the Cal State University Los Angeles Saturday Conservatory, which was like a program built for kids like me to learn how to play instruments. And when I was at college, I played in the concert band and in the Yale Precision Marching Band. So I spent a lot of time banding. And that was actually, that organization was one of the organizations that really let me, I think, feel like I belonged at Yale in a way that some of my other friends who didn't have these kinds of organizations didn't.
And so you, when you were in the band, it would not be a liberal arts MBA show if we didn't talk about someone's abroad experience. Although I would like to say that this time around, I had no idea that this was coming until we had our prep call, just to let our community know. So you had two things that happened. So you were in this performance band that got invited to play for some huge celebration in St. Petersburg. And you also you were a Ron Brown Scholar, which is a scholarship program for African-American kids to go to college, but didn't just pay for college. It actually paid for all the wonderful experiences that we think of when we think of the quintessential American college experience. Yeah. And so how did you get to St. Petersburg? Tell us the story.
So the Yale Concert Band has a long history of traveling abroad. I think it was one of the first American ensembles to go abroad after World War II. And when my first year, the trip that they were going on, which is every 2 years more or less, was to play for the tercentennial celebration of the founding of the city of St. Petersburg, Russia, right? Which is mind-boggling for me still, that I would be able to do this kind of trip. And
how old is tercentennial?
300 years.
Asking for a friend. Okay.
300 years. And so, on the other hand, I still am, being a Ron Brown Scholar is something that's forever. The money runs out, but the fellowship, the family, the support network doesn't.
So important. Those programs don't just stop because your college years are done. That network is important. As
an alum, I'm really committed. So I'm hosting Ron Brown Scholars at my house who are coming to Yale to welcome them to town, that kind of thing. But as the Ron Brown Scholarship at the time, and I believe still today, actually can help you with education-related expenses, right?
Amazing.
So as a member of the concert band, I asked if I could spend some money on, spend some of my scholarship money to rent a tux, because we performed in tuxes, and the scholarship said, well, actually, that might not be a good usage of your money. How many times will you need a tux? And I said, oh, well, 5 or 6. And they said, well, maybe you should buy one, right? And then when I was going on this quote school trip, they helped me pay for that trip. I mean, not extravagantly, right? Like I still had to make sure that I worked my student job in order to have spending money there, because they couldn't just, give me an open-ended thing, but they helped me pay for my portion of the trip. And so that summer that beginning of that summer was kind of life altering, right? I just ended this school year where I lived in a castle, right? Because the dorms at Yale are like castles. I met all these phenomenal friends, and here I am going abroad, right? Where we did river cruises, in the shadow of castles in Prague, or did concerts in. We did a concert in the church in Iraq, in Helsinki, and learned to sing Finlandia with the Helsinki University Wind Ensemble while we were in a sauna that had been put there by Russian soldiers in the last occupation. And we got multiple standing ovations from babushkas in Novgorod. And I got to play Shostakovich in Shostakovich Hall in St. Petersburg.
And how did this experience help you? You talked about, you started this with saying this group helped you cultivate a sense of belonging in this space of Yale. And also it sounds like a more worldly space as well, outside of just the confines of the US. How did that cultivation of a sense of belonging help you better understand yourself? What did you learn about yourself in this?
Well, it's actually what happened right after. There was an interesting juxtaposition, right? So I did this incredible trip, and for just a moment, I forgot just how poor I'd grown up. And then the idea was I was going to spend the summer in Texas with my uncle, helping him out at his insurance agency. And I thought I was flying from New Haven, or at least New York, to Beaumont, Texas. And it turns out I was actually waiting for me in my P.O. box was a bus ticket. And so I got my happy behind on a bus for 3 days. And did not enjoy that summer. And I'm not sure that how little I enjoyed that summer was actually what happened that summer. I think it was the juxtaposition of leading this very glamorous life and then suddenly leading this very unglamorous life. And so I actually asked the Ron Brown Scholars Program the next year. I called Miss Evans and said, Miss Evans, I like who I get to be and who I am and who I get to cultivate when I'm in New Haven. I'd like to stay in New Haven this summer. How can I make that happen? And it turns out the program had a partnership with a national collaborative of programs called Summer Bridge. And there was a Summer Bridge in New Haven. And she said, why don't you try out for this Summer Bridge program? It's 5 miles away at this school called Hopkins. You probably have never heard of it because undergrad world is so small. And it was then when I I actually did apply for that program. I stayed in New Haven. I've made New Haven my chosen place. And that program became Breakthrough and became the Pathfinder program. So I now run that program. So it was literally this juxtaposition between the kind of life I wanted to be able to lead and the life that I couldn't lead. That really enabled me to kind of accidentally discover teaching at the Summer Bridge program.
So tell us about once you started working for Summer Bridge. I haven't been a classroom teacher, and what was the transition like? The experience going into becoming a teacher for you?
So teaching is really hard work. And the thing that you don't realize as a student is the teachers that make it look the easiest are actually working the hardest for you, right? So to be able, as a history teacher, and we're storied, right? As a history teacher, I have to come in and if you say a comment about something tangential to and I let it go because you guys, the students, are really interested, right? I still have to know where I think that story could go, bring it back, right? I have to have thought of all of these tangential things and all of the ways that I can bring that back or make that useful for class. And you guys thought that you just got to riff for 35 minutes. It was like, no, right? And so it was just really, really hard work. And so the way that the Summer Bridge program or Pathfinder program now works is if you're a college student, you are teaching fellow, which means that you have some classes that you teach yourself, but you have constant mentorship by a professional teacher. And that, those teachers are always asking you to think more about your lesson, to plan more, etc. And so there's, this funny story, like at the end of that first summer, I'm a mama's boy. I talk to my mom like all the time, every day. She's gonna, if she's not on this call, she's going to end up hearing about it later. But I was in a little pocket park across the street from my crappy apartment in the summer of 2004, and I was like, telling her, Mom, blah 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 blah. She goes, you know what, Errol? Why don't you stop for a second? You've been telling me every day about all the work that you are doing with those kids, and how tired you are, and how there's still this one more thing. But you haven't complained once. And newsflash, you're kind of a complainer. Maybe you should consider being a teacher, right? And it turns out, like, my mom knows me better than anybody else, right? And, like, I actually do love my interactions with students more than anything else. And so, that's where I kind of got permission, right? Because as a first gen kid, you sometimes have to get permission to be a teacher, right? Because we don't make a lot of money. But also, I had to resist for a little bit. But when I applied for jobs, I actually only applied for teaching jobs, and I applied for a job at Hopkins, where to teach history, which is what I've been teaching at Summer Bridge / Pathfinder, and interviewed with a lot of the people I knew already, so it wasn't as stressful. And got to be, at that time, the assistant director of Summer Bridge and a history teacher. So instead of coaching.
Yeah. There's so many things that I love about that story in terms of what it highlights about, like, giving ourselves permission to lean into who we are. And there's so much, Jacob and I have talked about this from the perspective of being like, two Jewish kids that grew up in like really quintessential middle-class Jewish families, but, having to get over ourselves, to be ourselves, and to come to our families and be like, we're actually like kind of storytellers. And Jacob and I tell stories in different ways, but, you can ask my grandma, I'm not becoming the right doctor. I'm becoming a doctor. They're all very proud of me. It's the wrong kind of doctor, though, for the family. And recognizing in ourselves, that we come talking about place and belonging and memory and how that impacts us, as first gen kids or kids growing up in different family structures with different expectations of who we're supposed to be and present in the world, that finding those sorts of places where we build the networks for ourselves and find who we are in them, those experiences are like foundational in our college years and like really set us up. So I love that your story highlights that, and that you now work with other students who, I think the students that you work with are in very similar positions as you. Is that right?
So the Pathfinder students that I work with are absolutely in very similar situations as me. We have 120 Pathfinder students. Most of them are first generation kids. Most of them are kids from racially minoritized communities. Most of them many of them are first generation in this country, and many of them are from low income backgrounds. My Hopkins students are a very different kind of student, but I love being in this space where I can contain multitudes and be who I need to be for lots of different kinds of people, right? And so it's really fun to kind of be in this liminal space and also be able to be my full self in this liminal space.
So important. I want to use this moment to transition into the liberal arts tidbit, because I think it fits so nicely with the ability that you have to relate to students that you can see yourself in and they can see themselves in you. And this liberal arts tidbit is brought to us by Errol Saunders himself on In Placed Belonging. I don't know if Errol knew I was going to do this, but he is a scholar. And so we are citing him here first. So we shared with the community your 10-minute video exploring your lit review for your dissertation. And this comes from there. Students are learning hidden curricula of civics lessons by engaging in school choice. Some are learning about geographies of opportunity alongside geographies of education's shame and stigma, and grappling with questions about democratic fairness, racial and economic justice, and injustice. Perhaps most interesting, some students engaging in school choice are learning which school spaces belong to whom as they engage in a process of spatial sorting. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to let our community take a breath and sit with that because there's a lot. Errol, I'm wondering, as we all breathe, if you can help us breathe into it and kind of unpack this. What does it mean that there are geographies of opportunity alongside geographies of education? And what is this spatial sorting that's happening in those geographies?
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to kind of talk about this is to think about what middle-class families do when they're thinking about buying a house, right? When middle-class families are thinking about buying a house, particularly ones who have young children or who don't yet have children, if that's what they're going to do, one of the ways that they make choices is by where the schools are, quote, good, right? And so already there we are seeing the geographies of schooling overlapping with where wealth will go, right? So middle-class families often opt out of urban school districts or of schools with lots of low income or students of color because of perceptions of the schools being bad, right? There's actually quite a bit of research that says that actually it's just perceptions. Like even if you hold all things equal, but you increase the number of students of color, white families and middle-class families will go elsewhere, right? Similarly, kids are learning lessons about these things. So if you are a kid in an urban school district that's been, like New Haven or New York or Los Angeles or in lots of other parts of the country where you have a neighborhood school, there's this constant drum beat of needing to choose the right school. And that somehow just going to the school in your neighborhood, near your community, embedded within your community, where you might have known people or where your parents might have connections on themselves, is, quote, not right. And so you learn that where you're from isn't good enough and you have to go somewhere else, right? And then you also learn things like where the white kids are the good schools, right? Where the rich kids are the good schools. And it just doesn't have to be this way, right? Like a lot of people think about this as something that kind of naturally occurs. And, one of the arguments of the educational literature is that each of these learnings are culturally dependent, time dependent, and entirely optional. It is not the natural way of things. They are the results of systems we put in place. So for example, if you go to Finland, the best schools are where the poor kids are, because the poor kids are actually dealing with significantly more disadvantages. And so the Finns put significantly more resources into schools that have kids who are not wealthy than they do in the ones where the students are disproportionately wealthy.
Right. That's so helpful in understanding, and it tracks. You mentioned earlier that your mom knew kind of which school you needed to go to. It sounds like that's coming up in here, that your mom had the same sort of sense of where you needed to be because she had an understanding of like what was operating in these systemic ways.
And that's really what I find really interesting is that everyday people understand the consequences of these systems. They might not understand how they work, but they understand the consequences of these systems. Ordinary people understand that if one moves from the center city to an inner ring suburb, that there's some kind of advantage that accrues to you, right? Ordinary people, and we have kind of mythologized these kinds of choices by calling some of them the American dream, right? So it's just a really interesting take to me that you don't have to have an Ed.D. or PhD in education to kind of get this. In fact, the way that it works is that people who don't
Right.
these choices over and over and over again, and turn their perceptions into a reality.
So in New Haven, you're excuse me for my throat there. You've been living there now for like 15 years?
If you
can count college too?
If you count college, 15 years is about right, because I spent some time in New York for my PhD. My Ed.D. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you're a citizen there, and you are actively engaged in a lot of things in New Haven, beyond the foundation, beyond the school. So just tell us a bit about that. It was interesting to hear from you, a lot of the rich history of New Haven, and with your expertise in the development of cities and suburbs, and the impacts on individuals and on culture and society, that you have some perspective to bring to how you participate there.
Yeah. So I read, my advisor in college for several years was Douglas Ray. And Doug Ray wrote a book called City, Urbanism, and Its End. And there was one really cool chapter, and I know that it's the chapter that most people skip over, and that's one I was like, oh my goodness, I got dorked out about. And
I love this about you, by the way. You always draw me to the parts in readings where I want to skip, and you're like, no, this is the most important part.
And it was on what he called civic fauna. And the argument he was making, so this book is making an argument that essentially, using New Haven as an example, that cities once had the tools and market command to do the things that they wanted to do equitably, but when they did, they didn't have the political wherewithal. And now that they have the political wherewithal, they actually don't have the market position that they had anymore, right? And in this particular chapter, he is talking about what he called the civic fauna. And one of the ways that, some people might call it social capital. That's not my favorite framing, but civic fauna was all of the interlocking organizations with different kinds of people that made the social fabric of the city work, right? And so he would talk about how on the Winchester Repeating Arms, the Winchester Repeating Arms baseball team, the managers played on the team, but they were not necessarily the captains. Or how many Elks clubs and Knights of Columbus groups there were, and all of these ways that people mixed and had impacts on the ways that the city ran, right? And basically what my takeaway from that was that civic engagement, joining things, was actually a really important thing for making sure that the city worked for you and for people like you, right? And so I'm a self-proclaimed chronic joiner. I join things. So one of the first things I joined in New Haven is I lived in a condo in a neighborhood that was it was actually the 3 blocks between the wealthiest neighborhood in the city on the top of the hill and the poorest neighborhood in the region at the bottom of the hill. And I lived smack dab in the middle of the hill. And there's an organization called the Urban Resources Initiative, which is a collaboration between the city of New Haven, the Yale School for the Environment, and a prison to society reentry program called Emerge. And they will plant trees for free in front of where you live. All you have to do is call them up. So I was like, I want a tree, right? So I called him up because there were no trees. And New Haven is a city of street trees, right? It's called the Elm City, but my block didn't have any. So I called him up, met the urban forester, met the crew from Emerge, got a phone call later where they had cited on the property where the trees could go, and there was like a slight change from where they thought it was. And I just thought this was the coolest thing, like the coolest thing. And so I actually ended up joining some like volunteer days for that, and then was like, I want to help run this. This is super cool, right? Like, and at the time, there weren't very many people of color on the board. Right? And there certainly weren't any people who lived in this marginal neighborhood, right? So I promised myself years ago that I would never live somewhere where my presence is a news event for very obvious reasons. And so I'm constantly finding myself as someone who, in these liminal spaces, right? Where a place where a middle-class Black man can live, but where his walking down the street doesn't cause other people to call the police on him. Right? And so the fact that I lived in that neighborhood, the fact that I was really interested in this thing, the fact that I actually studied New Haven as an undergrad and like had familiarity with neighborhoods that other board members didn't, right? Like turned into a real asset, right? From there, I've joined other things, from people I've met and things that I find interesting in places I go. Like, I really loved going to the farmer's market. I was like, what is this? You can just buy food from the farmer and you can talk up to the farmer. Like, you talk up the farmer about like, oh, what was the season like for all of this, right? And then finding out, oh, wait, we have community gardens. There are people who farm their own food in the city. What? And like combining all of that with my love of the environment, and ended up being on the board of the New Haven Land Trust, which does community gardens and nature preserves. So things I really care about.
Do you have any? You are the type of person that you had made this commitment to yourself to find these spaces and places and to be involved. And I'm wondering if you can offer our community. It's so important. We've talked about this theme a few times now in this hour, to be in spaces as a democratizing presence. That way, other people in the community see themselves around tables of power and actually active in organizations that are trying to, be the change in the community. That actually, like, being the change in the community involves the community, and we are that community. And so as millennials, you as a person of color, as a man of color, Jacob and I, in our experience, is that it takes all of us being at that table. And yet, particularly for millennials, that seems like yet another obstacle and another barrier of entry into society. So I'm wondering if, based on your experiences, you can offer our community any advice on how to seek out, boards of directorships or, organizations in their communities and try to get involved in this way. Is there anything you can offer them?
So I will offer three things because I like numbered lists. The first thing is, we are, as millennials, are a really civically engaged group. We just do engagement differently, right? So we might volunteer, we might be magnifying social media posts, we might be out marching or raising money for organizations, right? And so part of it is for us to think about, what is the next step in my engagement with this organization or this community, right? So I was really excited that I got some trees, because I grew up in a place where poor people didn't have shade. And I know it's so bizarre, but like Los Angeles is like that, right? And so now that I'm in New Haven, where poor people can have shade, that's something that I care about that other people don't care as much about. They might care about the like aesthetic reasons and things like that. And so when I was presented with this opportunity, I thought about, well, how can I be involved next? So if you're going and you're volunteering at at your food pantry, or you're volunteering for a co-op that you're a member of, or you are marching in a march for some kind of social justice, thinking about, okay, so now what's my next step? I always, because for some things, I'm the person who shows up to march. I'm the person who shows up to stuff envelopes. For other things, I'm like, this is something I really am willing to dedicate a lot of time to. And we are now at an age in our generation where lots of boards are looking for young people. They're looking for generational change, right? And they're looking for people who are different in many ways than the people on the board already. And so, calling up organizations that you already care about and being like, how can I be more involved? Somebody on that governance committee is going to be like, I will tell you how. I actually said all three of them at once without the numbers. I'm sorry about that.
Perfect. That's perfect. And practical and actionable.
Yeah, just do the things you were already going to do. And then ask, how can I affect more change by doing it with this organization? If you already like an organization, then there's no reason, sure, you can give money to it, and then you can decide how the money is spent, or be somebody who's in charge of raising the money,
right?
Or think about strategic direction, because boards do that, or being, a lot of boards actually have task forces for people that they, things that need to get done, right? So like hiring the new community director for a thing, right? They have people from the community on this task force as an opportunity to be more engaged. And that gives you a feel for like, how do I like the way this organization is run? Could I do more with the organization this way? And also lets the organization know that you're the real deal. You're serious about helping out for some of the less glamorous things.
Right.
Well, yeah, thanks for explaining that and really giving permission for people to step up in any kind of way. I like that you shared all those different ways and kind of went into them, because there are a lot of different shapes and forms. But in particular, I thank you for, inviting and giving permission for people in our generation to start stepping up on the boards of these organizations and civic groups.
Errol, you said you have one last thing.
Yeah, I forgot the most important thing. The thing number 3. Lots of communities have community foundations.
Yes.
Foundations that are explicitly there to help other nonprofits. And one of the things that's really cool about the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, which I think lots of other places do, is they actually have board mixers. When you are a young person, a young professional in a town, go to your community foundation, which you can sometimes just Google community foundation plus community name, right? And see if they have any board mixers where they try to connect young people with organizations that want young people to help them.
Yes.
Right? So that's another concrete thing you can do. You can just Google it. You can connect with the, see if there's a mixer. If you've missed the mixer, call the person who was supposed to be in charge of it and see, like, what are some of the organizations that still haven't found anyone, especially if you're like most millennials where you're moving around places. It's a great way to start in a community to figure out where you can be useful.
Right. I love that. We are at time, but it's my show partially, so I get to decide when we end. Just to end this on the most academic note I could possibly end this conversation on. This is a big part, as Errol and Jacob know, of my research, which is about, how do we dismantle plutocracies, in other words, the voice of the elite in decision-making around funding in particular. And these community foundations and plugging in with them both to meet other organizations, but to also make yourself known to the foundation members and your interests known for them. These are the networks in which young people can actually start to determine how the money is spent and where it goes and what communities invest in. And if we are not there, and it's not to say that we all need to be there, although certainly join the party. There's actually more than enough money out there, so join the party. But if we are not there to put our hands up and say, actually not here, but there, then the money's going to stay over here. And over here might not be where it needs to be. It might not be reaching the members of our community that need it the most and that are least likely to be seen when the funding is being distributed. So I'm absolutely there. I'm going to go into rapid fire now that I've ended on a really academic note. Let's change it up a little bit. Errol, we're going to make you a playlist. What are the top 3 tracks on your repeat list right now, songs or podcasts?
Okay, so first one, Juice by Lizzo. Easy. All right. Second one, Hell on Wheels by Cher. And if you don't know that music video, she is literally riding roller skates down the street, and I love it. The third one is a podcast. It's a Harry Potter podcast nominally, but it's called Witch Please. It's done by these two incredible Canadian academics who teach you how to use critical frameworks to analyze Harry Potter, right? So I use it to learn new critical frameworks because it's super cool. It's super fun.
I love it. What are you reading right now? Oh, sorry, Jacob. Jacob, do you want to ask it?
Oh, we all heard you ask it. What are you reading right now, Errol? Sorry.
I'm reading The Color of Success by Conscious, Race and High Achieving Urban Youth. So this guy decided, you know what? Why don't we study what's going well with kids as opposed to what isn't? And maybe we can learn about how race and class and academic success work by looking at folks who, for whom it's actually working, as opposed to folks that we've problematized somehow.
What's something that people misconceive about your profession, or something that you want people to know about what you're doing?
So this is going to be a little bit of a hot take. Yeah, I think sometimes people expect good schools to do everything, to undo the effects of all of the overlapping systems of oppression and inequity in society. And it's true. Good schools contend with those systems and educate children anyway. But sometimes if we want to eradicate poverty or systemic racism or healthcare disparities or blah, 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 maybe we should just direct our societal attentions to those things directly instead of thinking that we can pack our aspirations into another period at school of required subject matter or a new wraparound program and then hoping it works out. It turns out we know how to end poverty. We can give people money. Right? We have all kinds of cultural aspersions to doing that. But one of the things we learned pretty recently, with the dramatic fall in childhood poverty rates in this country over the pandemic, is that it turns out if you give people money, they will be less poor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And schools can do better at the things that they actually are supposed to do, right? Instead of doing everything that American society doesn't want to do and just being plopped into a 19th century Victorian school building.
I'm going to leave that hot take where it's at. Yes. Just kidding. We're going to do one more. What are your guiding mantras?
All right. You probably could have guessed these. If you love it, participate to return the love. If you like how it works, participate to keep it working well in a changing world, right? And if you think it should be different, participate to make it what you would, right? There are no excuses for not wanting to be involved, right? And the more people who look like me, the more people my age, the more that we actually are putting our interests forward and our participation, the more we can demand to be constituencies of various organizations in the governance of how they make decisions.
Yes, and I'm just going to say, for the white people out there listening to this, those of us who are allies need to show up and actually be allies. We need to know when to be quiet and pass the mic to people like Errol to make sure that we are there supporting them and being a voice in those spaces. So it's a two-way street.
And after this, if y'all contact me after, I can tell you about some really great ally stories where allies knew when not to pass the mic. Yes. And when to be like, actually, us white people need to do this thing.
Yeah.
Right. So that was, those things are really important too.
We're the best improv troupe there is out there. We're yes-anding ourselves through all of this. Y'all, this is the end of episode 10 of Liberal Arts MBA. all the gratitude, cultivating, and belongingness to Errol Saunders, soon to be
Thank you so much, Errol.
The second EDD. Very excited for that. If you would like to get in touch with Errol, please find him on LinkedIn. You can search for Liberal Arts MBA as well. He's linked to all of our posts. That's the best way to find him. Please check out his research on YouTube and any of the other organizations that he is a part of, including the Ron Brown Scholars Network and Common Ground in New Haven. We've linked all that with the episode. And thank you every week for showing up and watching. Next week's guest is going to be Rachel Fogel, who is a dear long-term friend of mine and Jacob's, who is a career counselor extraordinaire. She has helped people build resumes, help people think through their careers and their dreams as she has done this for herself and thinking through hers, as well as centering mental health along the way. So we're going to be talking to Rachel Fogel. Jacob, tell people where to watch.
So please like and subscribe wherever you are. If you're watching this video, either right now as we're talking or in the future, please share it and send it to anyone who will enjoy this content and the discussions we've had here today. You can also comment on this video, whether you're on Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube later on. And we want to hear your feedback and we'll engage back. So you can find us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on Twitter, and on YouTube. And wherever mixtapes are sold. No, I'm just joking there. So great, yeah, wonderful. So here, thank you for joining us again today, everybody, and thank you, Errol.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everyone.